Unit 5 is on populations, and our first half of the unit we're going to focus on animal and plant populations in what we call population ecology. Population dynamics is the study of how populations change in size, density, and age structure in response to environmental change. We're going to get to know this graph very well. It's a common pattern that we see in most animal and plant populations. Before we recognize these patterns, let's define some terms. The first term we're going to define is what we call biotic potential. Biotic potential is defined as a population's capacity for growth. Depending on the species, depending on the population, we're going to see dramatic variation in biotic potential. And actually, we draw the line between two major strategies or sort of camps of reproductive strategy. The first are what we call R strategists or R selected species. R selected species have astounding biotic potential. They reproduce early in life, they reproduce many times, and they have many, many offspring. Take the typical common household fly. A single female, if left to her own devices without limited resources, would actually reproduce and yield descendants on the order of just about 6 trillion within 1 year's time. Within a few short years, that would be enough flies to eventually encapsulate the Earth. Thankfully, they can't do that. They will encounter resistance. But the idea here is all about putting all of their energy, all of their sort of proverbial eggs in one basket, and that is reproduction. There's very little to no parental care. The idea is to have so many offspring that some of them actually survive to reproduce. They're typically small, they're typically generalists. They're opportunistic. If there's a food resource, they'll exploit it. Their numbers will explode, they'll boom, and then once that resource is gone, they will bust. Not all of them are small, however. For example, the leatherback sea turtle. I had the opportunity to study leatherback sea turtles in Costa Rica, where I was awarded a fellowship, and we actually studied the populations along the beach where they reproduced. The female would crawl out of the ocean, sometimes 9 times during a mating season. And she was absolutely huge. You know, think of like a VW bug, a car just pulling out of the ocean. They can get up to 1,500 pounds. The female would then excavate a hole in the sand, deposit up to 80 to 100 eggs, and then cover it. And then she'd take right off, get right back into the ocean, keep feeding, and do this perhaps 8 more times during the breeding season. After a few short weeks, those eggs would hatch, and up to 100 of these hatchlings would emerge from the sand. You can envision this. It would be like sort of like Normandy or D-Day, right? Because now all these little hatchlings are trying to crawl out to sea, but they have all of these predators just picking them off left and right. So we call this predator satiation. The idea here is to have so many that not all the predators can actually eat them all. In fact, 1 in 1,000 of these tiny little hatchlings survive to adulthood. Not only are they going to be eaten on the beach and picked off, but once they get into the ocean, predators there will also grab and snatch them very quickly. So this is our strategy. The other end of that spectrum is what we call K strategy, or K-selected species. The idea here is to have few offspring. They reproduce infrequently. They have to reach sexual maturity, which takes far longer compared to an R strategist. An elephant, for example, has a gestation time of 645 days, where she'll only have 1 or 2 offspring. So here, they're not focusing on having a huge number, but rather having a few and then ultimately taking very good care of them. So parental care is critical. More often than not, K-selected species are specialists, as they do very well in a competitive environment. Another term I want to define is what we call the intrinsic rate of increase. This is exponential growth. It's the rate at which a population would grow if it had unlimited resources, such as that household fly. In other words, unlimited amount of water, unlimited amount of light, no competition, perhaps no predation, all sorts of food at their disposal. Our strategists grow at their intrinsic rate of increase, and consequently we call them R strategists, lowercase r. Where does this happen on the growth curve? It's the J-shaped curve. This is exponential growth. It's population growing at a fixed rate over a specified amount of time, such as 1 to 2%. It is deceptive because it starts off really slowly, but then it snowballs and grows faster as the population increases because the base of the population is growing. So notice it takes a long time to build momentum, but then once we start building a critical mass, we start seeing it grow really, really quickly. So it is quite deceptive. Take a piece of paper. You fold that piece of paper 42 times, you reach the moon. So it's pretty amazing the potential and the power of exponential growth. Thankfully, populations cannot grow at their biotic potential indefinitely. They cannot grow at their intrinsic rate of increase because ultimately we do hit limits. We call these limits environmental resistance. It's the combination of all factors that act to limit the growth of a population. Population sizes are imposed or limited by a number of limiting factors such as light, water, space, nutrients, too many competitors, or predators. The size of any given population is the result of the interplay between the biotic potential and the environmental resistance. And what puts a cap on a population growth is an ecosystem's carrying capacity. It is defined by the uppercase letter K. This, of course, is where K-selected species reside. In a competitive world, specialists do well. Carrying capacity, therefore, can be defined as the maximum number of individuals of a given species that can be sustained indefinitely in a given space. So if we think of the Lam Woods on Sutherland's campus, how many chipmunks can that forest sustain? And the carrying capacity is not a static value. It can actually vary. When an ecosystem is thriving, with an abundance of vegetation, productivity, healthy soils, the carrying capacity can be quite high. If that system has been degraded, soils eroded, compacted, a lack of nutrients, a lack of productivity, the carrying capacity is diminished. Carrying capacity, we know, is defined by biotic potential and environmental resistance. So notice where carrying capacity resides. It's where biotic potential interfaces with the resistance of an ecosystem. And that's what defines K, or the carrying capacity. Populations, when confronted with unlimited resources, grow at their intrinsic rate of growth, R, exponentially, forming a J-shaped curve. Eventually, these populations, growing to their biotic potential, will encounter limits. Competition, water, resources, food, predation will eventually level that population out as it approaches K, or the carrying capacity. This is where K strategists reside because they are typically specialists and they do very well in these competitive situations. This is what we call S-shaped growth. Exponential J-shaped growth gets converted to what we call logistic or S-shaped growth as the population encounters the carrying capacity. That's it for now, guys. We'll see you soon.